谁为爱世人愿舍身？这礼物化作活存的心灵，幸福是接受和活出这礼物的真谛，教我学习爱到同时就如遇见主。人一生最如赶，艳阳纵使多耀眼，如若没爱，仿佛天空阻隔了光线的障眼。请洁净我心眼，长留着爱的恩泉，清似璀璨。
In here represents our children. Our little girls and little boys that never came back while attending residential school.
In their honor and the children's memory, these shoes are not a gift. Rather, they're given with the mutual understanding that the Pope will one day accompany them back to Canadian soil.
我為天主教會入面一啲成員嘅可悲行徑，請求天主嘅寬恕。我從心底向你哋所有人講，好對唔住。與此同時，我懷住感恩嘅心情，諗起嗰啲善良正直嘅信徒，佢哋以信仰嘅名義，以尊重、愛同埋慈悲嘅名義，藉住福音豐富咗你哋嘅歷史。你哋當中好多人都好敬愛耶穌嘅外祖母聖亞納。喺佢嘅紀念日嘅前後幾日，我希望同你哋一齊。
2022年7月24至29日，教宗方濟各到訪加拿大。對上一次有教宗嚟到加國，已經係2002年，教宗聖若望保祿二世到訪多倫多出席普世青年節。教宗方濟各叫呢次訪問做懺悔朝聖之旅，主要目的係向原住民表達關懷、悲痛之情，並且請求寬恕。喺加拿大，原住民寄宿學校制度可以追溯到1830年代。喺1883至1996年間，估計有15萬名3至16歲嘅原住民學生被逼入讀呢啲聯邦寄宿學校。呢啲寄宿學校係根據聯邦政府嘅政策同法律而設立，旨在控制同埋同化原住民。2006年，加拿大政府連同有份營辦寄宿學校嘅多個教會團體同埋原住民代表簽署一份名為印第安寄宿學校和解協議 （Indian Residential Schools Settlement Agreement）。除咗金錢上嘅賠償，協議嘅其中一個具體行動係成立寄宿學校真相與和解委員會 （Truth and Reconciliation Commission）， 簡稱 TRC。
The Pope came here at the request of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report, when they asked that the Pope, as the head of the Roman Catholic Church, which cooperated in the majority of the residential schools, if he would come and on behalf of all the Catholics and all the people that worked in the residential schools, make an apology. So he did that.
Father Robert 係一位耶穌會神父，有多年服務原住民嘅經驗。佢同2位原住民修女 Sister Priscilla 同埋 Sister Eva， 隨同耶穌會代表團親身參與教宗呢次懺悔朝聖之旅嘅部分行程。
The three of us went to Edmonton, where the Pope visited just recently. I myself went begrudgingly at the beginning. I didn't want to go just to see the Pope. I wanted to make an apology. But I finally decided to go because I wanted to apologize along with the Pope.
At the beginning, I thought I can see it on the television. I'll hear the apology on the television. And then I received the invitation and immediately knew that I needed to go to Edmonton to join with the Jesuits, because we do have a lot of shared spirituality, and both Eve and I have worked with the Jesuits in the past and have a lot of good friendships. So I just thought that I want to do that.
Sister Priscilla 同 Sister Eva 都係安省蘇聖瑪麗聖若瑟修女會嘅修女，亦都係親生姊妹，自細喺安省北部長大。佢哋嘅父母都曾經入讀原住民寄宿學校。Sister Eva 記起一次佢媽媽同同學相認嘅經驗，令佢十分感慨。
I remember an experience I had, an elder that I happened to notice in the arena, and I mentioned to my mom to look at that lady, and I had no idea that she was seeing somebody who went to school with her in
Spanish 係安省北部嘅一個小鎮，距離安省北部最大嘅城市 Sudbury 大概1個鐘車程。喺1913至1965年間，分別有2間原住民寄宿嘅全男校同全女校。2位修女嘅父母分別入讀 Spanish 嘅呢2間寄宿學校。
And we went over to the lady, and she said, "Did you go to school with me at Spanish?" And she said, "Yes." She said, "You were number 111. And I could not believe what I was hearing. I knew my mother had said her number was 9, but I couldn't believe that they had no identity as a person. They were called by a number, and I thought, wow, that's just like in Germany when they called prisoners by their number. And I thought, wow, both my parents had lost their identity as an Indigenous person. They were not called by name. Like the father said, "I've called you by name." What did that say to their spirits?
教宗呢次懺悔朝聖之旅喺愛民頓展開，第一站係愛民頓以南大約1個鐘車程嘅馬斯亞西斯 Massachusetts， 嗰度係加拿大其中一間最大嘅前原住民寄宿學校嘅所在地。教宗首先喺墓地逗留靜默祈禱，之後佢進入會場出席原住民幸存者嘅集會。教宗入場之後，多位原住民酋長亦都喺鼓聲嘅伴隨之下進場。進場嘅隊伍裏面，有人拎住一幅50米長嘅紅色橫額，上面印有4120位喺寄宿學校死亡或者失蹤嘅學生嘅名。教宗就係喺呢次集會裏面第一次喺加拿大嘅土地為天主教會對原住民所造成嘅傷害道歉。
We got up at 3 o'clock in the morning to go to Massachusetts. So we arrived there and were gathered with many Indigenous survivors of residential schools. It was cold and raining a little bit.
Watching him as he entered into the powwow grounds was another significant moment, because he came with his head down. He came in a spirit of penance, in a spirit of prayer. So I'm grateful for that witness that he gave to us as well.
Finally, there was a talk by the Holy Father, and the Holy Father apologized sincerely over and over again.
我嚟到呢度，嚟到你哋中間，因為我呢次懺悔朝聖之旅嘅第一步，係要再次請求寬恕，再一次同你哋講，我深切道歉。我為好多基督徒支持殖民主義勢力壓迫原住民而道歉，對唔住，我求你哋寬恕，特別係為好多教會嘅成員同埋修道團體同當時嘅政府合作，因為佢哋嘅冷漠，參與咗一啲毀滅文化同埋強制同化嘅項目，而呢啲項目最終導致原住民寄宿學校系統嘅出現。
I heard it as a very sincere and genuine apology from Pope Francis, and I had a very strong sense that he was speaking for the whole church. he was not speaking for himself, but he himself was very deeply engaged in his desire for the apology and in his expression of the apology. So hearing him apologize was really, really important to me.
喺馬斯亞西斯成個集會裏面，最令在場嘅人百感交集嘅係以下呢一幕。
The high point of that talk was when Chief Willie Littlechild took a headdress and put it on the Pope's head.
When Wilton Littlechild put the headdress on the Pope, I immediately said to my sister, "We have a new Grand Chief. In the Assembly of First Nations, they have a Grand Chief like nobody else now, Pope Francis." And that really struck me. I was really impressed with that.
When Willie Littlechild put the headdress on the Holy Father, I choked up. I went running to some of the Indigenous elders, including Sister Eva and Sister Priscilla, and I gave them a big hug, because for me, the gesture of putting the headdress on the Holy Father's head meant that the Indigenous people were forgiving the Catholic Church for participating in the government-run and government policies of the residential schools and even for colonization.
正正就係呢一幕，令呢位原住民女士激動咁用克里語唱出所有加拿大人耳熟能詳嘅曲調。
How important it is to not generalize everybody. The reality is there were Indigenous people who experienced healing from the Pope's visit, who heard it as an apology, and there were Indigenous people who did not receive it that way and could not receive it that way. And we're all different. Each one of us is unique, and so it's the listening with respect is listening not just to a whole people, but also listening to people within that group and respecting where they are. And we're not all in the same place. And the reverse is true for us. We can't globalize all non-Indigenous people as all the same. That's why it's important to build relationships.
教宗喺加國土地首次道歉嘅舉動，鼓勵咗教會成員同原住民之間作更深入嘅交流，加深彼此嘅了解。
That afternoon, we had a sharing circle led by Sister Priscilla and Sister Eva, and they brought their pipe.
喺北美洲嘅原住民文化裏面，煙斗係一件神聖嘅物品，由煙斗吹出嚟嘅輕煙，將人同天地嘅主宰聯繫埋一齊。煙向上升，象徵祈禱上達天上嘅造物主。儀式嘅主持人會將煙斗傳到去參加者嘅手上。Father Robert 喺嗰次煙斗儀式之中有好深刻嘅體會。
We didn't smoke the pipe because of COVID, but we passed the pipe around. And when I held the pipe, I just felt that I was receiving absolution at the hands of Sister Priscilla and absolution from the Indigenous people for the sins that we have committed against them.
During that ceremony, the Spirit just made it very clear to me that the Pope is apologizing on behalf of all Catholics. And so I felt like I needed to express to the Jesuits with us, who have ministered to our people for many centuries, I just needed to express a sense of, I accept your apology. We who are here with you accept your apology.
I wasn't born when most of the residential schools closed. I wasn't involved. but I have lived on this land, and this land is the gift of Indigenous people to those who have come here. They shared it with us, and we took it all and put them on small reserves and took all the resources, and I have benefited from it. And so I needed to apologize, and that absolution from Sister Priscilla, a woman, an Indigenous person, meant so much to me.
教宗呢次探訪加拿大，媒體除咗關注寄宿學校系統對原住民社區所造成嘅破壞，亦都將目光放喺發現教義 （Doctrine of Discovery） 呢個議題上面。Father Robert 好欣賞原住民以和平嘅方式喺魁北克聖亞納大殿彌撒舉行期間，清晰表達佢哋嘅訴求。
Two Indigenous women very politely and respectfully went forward with the banner and stood in front of the altar and said, "Rescind the doctrine of discovery." No noise, no violence, just simply a message. We need that doctrine to be wiped off the books.
發現教義呢個名詞本身並非出自天主教會，而係指喺15世紀至17世紀期間，一啲歐洲國家以發現未有歐洲人去過嘅地方為理由，使奪取原住民居住嘅地方合法化。呢個概念後期被納入一啲國家嘅普通法，直接影響原住民嘅土地權益。發現教義亦都關乎15世紀期間，教宗尼各魯5世同埋歷山6世曾經頒布嘅3道詔書，容許西班牙同葡萄牙喺特定條件之下佔領領土，並且將原住民定為奴隸。呢啲詔書冇關注過原住民嘅權利，更冇經佢哋嘅同意就將土地讓俾歐洲國家。今日睇嚟顯然係唔公義嘅。
What the papal bulls and the doctrine of discovery said was that the land doesn't belong to anybody. The Indigenous people were there for generations, but it doesn't belong to them. Even if they're walking on the land, they don't count because they're not human, so we can take their land. So that beautiful, peaceful protest describes a part of the Indigenous mind and heart. Violence is not their way. In any other part of the world, they would have taken up guns and there would have been terrorism in Canada, but that's not the Indigenous way. They want peace and reconciliation for all. They shared in the beginning and they want to share now, but they do want to be respected for who they are.
事實上喺1537年，教宗保祿3世頒布另一道詔書，清晰指出天主愛所有人，而原住民嘅人身自由同原先佔有嘅土地都唔能夠被剝奪。保祿3世嘅信息亦得到之後多位教宗重申，佢哋都譴責任何形式嘅奴隸制度。
Part of reconciliation is just as the suffering has gone so far back into the whole process of colonization, not only here but globally, I think the restoration, the reconciliation will need to go back to that level. So at some point, my hope and my dream is that our Catholic Church will really articulate very clearly their understanding of what those 3 papal bulls were saying and how they no longer actually apply. The Church needs to claim the harm that came through the pronouncement of those bulls, and yet so much good has been done as well during that time. So I think there won't be reconciliation till all of the sources of colonization are owned and named and dealt with in a way that they're no longer on our legal books in different countries around the world. So the doctrine of discovery is still a legal reality. And so even though from the Church's perspective it's not legal, in civic law it is. So it needs to be dealt with.
隨住時代嘅發展，原住民嘅權益已經成為聯合國關注嘅議題之一。 聯合國大會喺2007年通過咗原住民族權利宣言，宣言得到幾十個國家嘅認可。雖然係咁，睇返加拿大，直至今時今日，唔少本地嘅原住民仍然因為種種艱難而掙扎。
We need people to come in and help us deal with this anger, deal with these issues that are plaguing our people.
加拿大嘅原住民由第一民族 First Nations、因紐特人 Inuit 同埋梅蒂人 Métis 組成。根據加拿大政府2016年嘅統計，全國大約有82萬人屬於註冊第一民族。當中40%嘅第一民族人口住喺保留區，保留區嘅居民嘅生活條件同一般加國居民有好大差距，連最基本嘅生活需要，好似安全清潔嘅食水，亦都得唔到。
The indigenous people are not treated equally in Canada. It seems to be equal, but it's not the same. It's atrocious to think that on so many reservations in Canada for so long, there were boiled water advisories. The rest of us have never had to deal with that.
We were just at a reserve yesterday where our cousins and some of our other relatives live. And today they are still waiting for their own water system that will be pure right from the lake. It wasn't too long ago that the village nearest to them, Wyerton, they had people die because of E. coli in the water. But none of them still today, and that's a good 20 years later, they still don't have clean drinking water.
Sister Eva 同埋 Sister Priscilla 嘅父親 Art Solomon 生前係一位勇於為原住民謀福利嘅先鋒同埋領袖，佢協助推廣原住民嘅工藝品，亦都同大學合作開創為原住民而設嘅課程。佢嘅貢獻令佢獲3間大學頒授榮譽博士學位。Sister Eva 曾經跟隨父母去過唔同原住民社區，親眼見過佢哋生活嘅苦況。
When I worked up north with my mom and dad, and that was a good 40 years ago now, they had no medical services. They had a woman who could translate a symptom to a doctor that they had to phone somewhere else. And the doctor would say, take 3 pills from jar number 7 and give them these for a while and then continue less times and so on. That was the kind of healthcare system that was there in our reserves.
根據統計數字，喺2018-2019年度入獄嘅成年人口之中，大約30%係原住民，但原住民其實只佔加國成年人口嘅4.5%，入獄率比一般人口高出好多倍。喺監獄服刑嘅原住民，亦都係 Art Solomon 生前極為關注嘅對象。Sister Eva 亦因此探訪過全安省嘅所有監獄。佢認為原住民嘅高入獄率同佢哋嘅人性尊嚴被剝奪有重大關係。
My dad spent 15 years volunteering in all the prisons in Ontario and all the federal prisons in the country. The reason they were in prison most often was because they had lost their sense of personhood. And I remember someone saying to me at one time, you have every right to be angry because you've had your personhood stolen from you. And when you can find yourself, then you won't have that anger. Who says that to our brothers and sisters in prison? We have lots of work to do.
身為原住民 ，Sister Eva 自細已經體驗過種族歧視嘅滋味。佢成長期間嘅經歷，亦都令佢好早就立志為自己嘅同胞服務。
When I was 6 years old, I came home from the first class of grade 1 crying because some of the children said comments to me about being a dirty Indian. And I came home to my mother and I said, Mama, why do they call me a dirty Indian? And she put her arms around me and she was sitting in a big green chair and she said, they do that because they never learned anything different, as much as to say it's not their fault. In 1959, something happened that changed me. And that was that my Uncle Ernest had been beaten by his friends and left in a ditch. And they had all been drinking. And I was standing at the foot of his bed praying to St. Catherine. In that prayer, I asked a critical question. Why do Native people do this to each other? They beat each other and they kill each other and they drink and they kill themselves. As fast as that question of doubt came, a response came. They're not all like that. Native people drink. That was the real reason why they had done what they had done. They drink because they don't know who they are. They don't know their own beauty and goodness and dignity. That's why they do the things they do. And I knew right away I was called to work with my own people.
教宗方濟各呢次懺悔朝聖之旅，其中一個目標係鼓勵整個教會踏上同原住民弟兄姊妹嘅治癒同和解之路。除咗向原住民道歉，教宗亦都特別同教會裏面嘅神職人員、修士、修女同牧民工作者會面，勉勵佢哋同埋所有基督徒，再唔能夠認為自身嘅文化比別人嘅文化優勝，
促進同所有人、同原住民弟兄姊妹、同我哋遇到嘅每一個弟兄姊妹之間嘅友愛關係，因為每個人嘅面容都反映住天主嘅臨在。
At the Vesper ceremony, the Holy Father said, "See God in the indigenous face." And that's very, very powerful because that's saying that in the indigenous person, we see Christ. And if we can only do that, then we can walk hand in hand. Part of reconciliation will have to do with becoming friends. And friendship happens when we listen with respect to each other. The problem with the residential schools was there was no respect. The government, with its policies, and those who cooperated with the policies, wanted to make the students like them. We are superior to the indigenous people. They are uncivilized. Now that was a huge sin of pride and a huge sin of not listening. Reconciliation means listening with respect. The indigenous people, through that whole process, had their identity attacked and almost destroyed. And so there's a lot of healing and reparation that has to be done. And maybe something similar can be said for all the immigrants that come to Canada. Each culture brings its gift. And if we can listen and respect, then all of us will grow. And that, I think, is the road we have to walk.
耶穌雖然具有天主嘅形體，卻使自己空虛，取咗奴僕嘅形體。佢貶抑自己，聽命至死，且死在十字架上。耶穌為咗天主與人呢個終極嘅修和所做嘅一切，為我哋揭示咗真正修和嘅先決條件。我哋點樣延續教宗方濟各今次訪家之旅所開展同原住民修和嘅旅程？關鍵在於我哋對他人嘅真正尊重同接納。只有真正謙卑自己，放下一己嘅想法同埋優越感， 視對方為朋友，先至會開始彼此聆聽，展開對話同修和嘅旅程。呢個亦都係我哋最終能否避免重蹈覆轍，令呢啲不公義嘅欺壓唔再喺人類歷史裏面發生嘅基礎。
喺1950年代，波蘭籍嘅平靜修女嚟到澳門開辦曉明中學，令到貧苦人家嘅女有機會讀書。
我記得我第一件校褸仲係用啲舊製品改造。
早餐呢，如果有腐乳茶麵包呢，就係覺得最好味、最好食嘅嘢㗎啦。
澳門曉明中學由一間簡陋嘅學校發展成為設備齊全而校譽出眾嘅平民學校。想知道曉明嘅故事，請唔好錯過呢一個星期嘅愛常傳。睇完呢一集嘅愛常傳，歡迎大家打我哋嘅熱線電話，分享一下你嘅感受或者係故事。同時都請收聽我哋逢星期六嘅電台節目《愛生命》，以及訂閱 Podcast。要購買天主教書籍同信仰靈修禮物，請嚟到我哋位於 Markham 嘅生命恩泉資源及媒體中心參觀選購。我哋下星期同樣時間再見，天主保佑。